Hello. So in this writing notes video, we're going to talk about analogies. Now, an analogy is a type of argument which compares two things, typically two unlike things. And there's a lot of different types of analogies. So this is an umbrella category that includes things like exemplification, simile, metaphor, comparison and contrast, etc., etc. Basically, analogy as a broad category is establishing an argument that two things are in some way alike. So, what makes this an argument? Well, analogy is a very common strategy that we use, but what makes it an argument, what makes it a piece of rhetoric or a rhetorical technique, is that it makes the claim that X thing is like Y thing. And we'll talk about some different types of analogies, but this is the basic movement of it. The claim in an analogy is that these two things share some characteristics. Not all characteristics, otherwise they'd be the same thing. Like you can't say a cat is like a cat. You can say that, but that's what we call a tautology, which is where you are comparing a thing to itself or establishing that a thing is like itself. And while that's true, it's not a great insight. So if I say a cat is like a cat, it doesn't really tell you anything. That's not a useful claim to make. But if I say, in the words of the famous poet Robert Burns, my love is like a red, red rose. Well, my love is not a red, red rose. There are many ways in which my love is dissimilar to a red, red rose. My partner does not have a green stalk. There's no chlorophyll in her. She does not take in energy from the sun and release oxygen, or whatever it is. In all of these ways, my love is dissimilar to a red, red rose. But what Burns wants us to get is not that. Like, that's not his point. His point is that there are certain characteristics that are shared between, in this case, the poet persona's love and a red, red rose. So, the sort of blossom of youth. That's another analogy, by the way, because youth is not really blossoming. Blossoming in a technical sense is a thing a flower does. That's an analogy. It is an argument that two things are similar, that youth is like a blossom in that it is sort of opening up its newness, its potential. So there's that element of it. The poet's love is attractive. The poet's love is sort of symbolic of something pleasurable, something that one would want to be around. So it's a simile in this case, which is a subset of analogy. A simile uses like or as to establish its comparison. So, my love is like a red, red rose is a simile because it uses like to establish the comparison. If it was, my love is a red, red rose, that would be a metaphor. So these are the two main types of analogies we tend to run into. Other than, well, okay, I'm going to take that back. These are two formal literary techniques for using analogy. The simile, comparing something using like or as, and the metaphor, something is that thing. So these are two techniques for constructing analogies. They both involve the same kind of move. It's really just a question of the grammar of your sentence that distinguishes these things. Well, I say that, but that's not necessarily entirely true, because that grammar is significant. So let's consider that for a moment. If I say, my love is like a red, red rose, I'm saying There are similarities, there are probably differences, shared characteristics, but not all characteristics are the same. Whereas if I use a metaphor and say my love is a red, red rose, this suggests that the characteristics are the same. So when, for instance, someone says men are dogs, the implication here is not there's some similarities and some differences. The implication is there is an identification between men and dogs. Those two Venn diagrams overlap exactly. With metaphor, that's not necessarily what's meant, but metaphor is stronger than simile in that way. So even though we know that there are differences between men and dogs have 4 feet, men have 2 feet, usually. Dogs usually have 4 feet. Dogs have muzzles and men have human monkey type faces. You get my point. But the idea here is that the grammar of the sentence in this case becomes significant. The difference between like and is significant in terms of the strength of this analogy. So, while these are both literary devices built on comparison, and they both use the same fundamental logic, one of them is weaker and one of them is stronger. 2 other significant types of analogy. One is exemplification. And I talked about this somewhat in my video on rhetorical methods of development, because exemplification is a method of development. Basically, exemplification is, as it says on the tin, providing examples. So these would be similar situations or comparable events, comparable contexts, whatever it is, that we as speakers or writers would argue provides us with information about the current situation. So, for instance, if I were in Congress and I wanted to pass a particular bill, I might look back at history or maybe at the experiences of other countries and say, here's an example of a situation that's similar to the one that we're in. This is what was done, and this is the outcome. So if we do a similar thing, if we take a similar action in this context, the outcome is likely to be similar. Whether that's desirable or something we would want to avoid, I would then have to make my case. But what I've done is provided an example. So here is something similar to what I'm making an argument about, and that similarity is significant for us. It tells us about the thing that I'm making an argument about. And then the other big type of analogy that you're likely to run into is comparison. Comparison is also a rhetorical method of development, or comparison and contrast. And this is typically a more formal, extended assessment of similarities and differences between 2 things. So it's going to work like a simile, but it tends to be more developed. So if I, for instance, wanted to describe Brothers Pizza, it's a pizza place around the corner from where I live. If I wanted to describe the taste and texture and whatever it is of that pizza to you, I might compare it to other types of pizza. So, is it like Domino's? Is it like Pizza Hut? Is it like Red Baron frozen pizza? Is it like whatever other type? Pick your type of pizza that your reader or listener would be familiar with. And by going through a list of ways in which it's similar or different, I'm doing comparison and contrast. And so this is again a form of analogy because it's looking at 2 things that are not the same, and it's assessing and making an argument about the ways in which they share characteristics. So, analogy is a really useful technique in rhetoric. It's something that you want to have a good grasp on, because analogy is a great way of illustrating your points. By identifying things that readers are likely to already be familiar with, you can make arguments about the thing that they presumably don't know as much about. So if we return to the Robert Burns example, presumably most readers of poetry are going to be familiar with roses, but they may not be familiar with the poet's beloved. So this is a way of illustrating for a reader who knows X thing what they should know about Y thing. So this is a useful technique. This does mean that as someone using rhetoric, as a writer or a speaker or whatever it is, you do want to make sure that your audience, your readers, are likely to know the thing that you are comparing your subject to. If they don't know, if you say X is like Y, X being the subject you're describing, Y being the thing you're comparing it to, if they don't know why, that analogy is likely to fall flat.